This video is sponsored by Card Kingdom. If you click on the link in the description below, it'll take you to their store and they'll know I sent you there. Hello everyone, I'm Hone, and it's that time again, limited review week on my channel. Core Set 2021 was fully revealed earlier today, and that means that I'll be putting out a new video every day talking about my first impressions of the set as a limited format. This includes talking about all the cards in the set individually, an archetype guide, and a top 10 on the biggest bombs in the format. As usual, we're starting today with white. A few disclaimers before we proceed. These ratings are, of course, based on my opinion before actually playing with the cards, so I will definitely get some things wrong. I usually do a video after a format to talk about what I got wrong. I actually still need to do the one for Ikoria, which hopefully I'll get to after I finish this set review. Also, just to restate it, because it always comes up in the comments, this video is only about limited. That means draft and sealed. I'm not commenting on constructed formats at all, except maybe for the occasional aside. Finally, I use a letter grade system to sum up how I feel about particular cards, and if you aren't familiar with what those letter grades mean, you can find an explanation of the grades in the comments. Alright, let's get started with our first white card. First up, it's Alpine Watchdog, which for one generic and a white is a 2/2 dog, not a hound. All the hounds from the game's past have been switched to dogs, and there's lots of dogs in this set. Anyway, he's a common, and he's got vigilance. A 2-mana 2/2 with Vigilance is normally probably just a C-. 2-mana 2/2s who have nothing else going on are a D+ these days, and Vigilance is not the most exciting keyword ability on a 2/2, so C- is where I'm gonna go. This guy does have some small additional synergies as a result of being a card that the red-white Signpost Uncommon can search up, and that does increase its value some, but I think he's still a C-, who maybe moves up to a C in that deck. Next up, it's Angelic Ascension, which for one generic and a white is an uncommon instant, and it says exile target creature or planeswalker, its controller creates a 4/4 white angel creature token with flying. This kind of card is always interesting. This can do a lot of stuff. You can use it to downgrade one of your opponent's creatures or to upgrade one of yours. The latter is more frequently going to be the plan because a 4/4 angel won't be much of a downgrade most of the time. The ideal thing to do with this is going to be use it at instant speed one way or another, either on a creature that is going to die to removal anyway, or in response to an opponent attacking, so you can turn your smaller creature into a 4/4 that can block more effectively. All that said, this kind of card pretty much always underperforms. It's exciting to think about turning your 1-drop into a 4/4 angel, but you are effectively 2-for-1ing yourself to pull that off, which is very dangerous. It can win you the game if your opponent doesn't have an answer, but if they do, you're going to be in trouble because of all the tempo you lose. That's why I'm more interested in playing it in situations where I make sure I trade for one of my opponent's cards. That way, it's no longer a 2-for-1. I think I'm just going to sit at C on this card. Based on similar cards we've seen over the years, this just won't line up as favorably as you want it to most of the time. Next up, it's Anointed Chorus, which for one white mana is a 1/1 human cleric at common. It's got lifelink, and you can pay 4 generic and a white to give it +3/+3 until end of turn. So a 1 mana 1/1 with lifelink is generally not a card worth playing. It just won't be relevant for very long, but adding an activated ability here makes things interesting. It is by no means an efficient way to pump the Chorister, but if you are flooding out, it gives you a reasonable mana sink, one that can turn the Chorister into quite the scary attacker in the later part of the game. What's more is, there is a black-white life gain archetype in this format, and many of the cards check to see if you have gained 3 life on a given turn, and obviously, if you activate this on a lifelink creature, you're going to get there. All that said, this isn't a great card, and not even one that you'll always play in your white decks, but I think you still play it more often than you don't, and it seems like a solid card to me. I'm giving it a C. Next up, we have Aven Gagglemaster, which for 3 generic and 2 white is a 4/3 bird warrior at uncommon. It's got flying, and when it enters the battlefield, you gain 2 life for each creature you control with flying. I like this card a lot, and not just because my fiance and I volunteer doing some waterfowl rescue work. On its own, this is a 5 mana 4/3 flyer that gains you 2 life when it comes down. That would probably be a C+ at worst. Those stats are good, and while the life is not incredible, it is upside. But this format has a blue-white Flyers deck, and the Gagglemaster gaining you 4 life instead isn't going to be far-fetched, and it will sometimes give you even more. I think this is going to be worth taking with the first pick some of the time, and I don't see most white decks cutting the first copy of this. I'm giving it a B-. Next up, we have Baneslayer Angel, which for 3 generic, 2 white, is a 5/5 angel at Mythic Rare. She's got flying, first strike, lifelink, and protection from demons and dragons. This is a reprint, and it was a bomb when we've seen it in the past, and it's a bomb here too. The stats are amazing, as are all those sweet keywords. The angel can come down and stabilize the board if you're behind, pull you ahead if you're at parity, and pretty much seal the game if you're ahead. She's difficult to attack through or block, and she gains you life when she does those things, and lifelink is really what makes her capable of taking the game over, since she is near impossible to race. The protection part will come up on occasion too, but it doesn't really factor into the grade here. Still, she's a bomb. I'm giving her an A. Next up, it's Basri Ket, who for 1 generic and 2 white is a legendary planeswalker Basri at Mythic Rare. He's got 3 loyalty. His +1 allows you to put a +1/+1 counter on up to 1 target creature, and that creature gains indestructible until end of turn. His -2 says whenever 1 or more non-token creatures attack this turn, create that many 1/1 white soldier creature tokens that are tapped and attacking. And his -6 says you get an emblem with, at the beginning of combat on your turn, create a 1/1 white soldier creature token, then put a +1/+1 counter on each creature you control. This is a nice, aggressive planeswalker. He doesn't do a great job of protecting himself, but he does do a nice job at improving your board state. He can kind of protect himself a little, in the sense that he may make one of your creatures into a better blocker, but most of the time, Basri wants you to be turning your creatures sideways. You can't take advantage of indestructibility if you don't, and you can't take advantage of his -2 without attacking either. His -2 will be able to just in-game sometimes if he comes down late, and that's going to be awesome. His emblem is strong too. Churning out tokens and making your whole board bigger every turn is a powerful thing. That said, due to his limitations, he isn't ultra likely to get to his ultimate most of the time, but even if he just comes down, does his +1, and does his -2 the next turn, you're usually going to be getting more than 3 mana's worth of value out of him. Basri is good, but I don't think he's a bomb planeswalker, and I actually think that's true for most of the Mythic Rare planeswalkers in this set, which is kind of interesting. You do want to take him with a first pick most of the time, though. I'm giving him a B. Next up, we have Basri's Acolyte, which for 2 generic and 2 white is a 2/3 cat cleric at common, has lifelink, and when it enters the battlefield, you put a +1/+1 counter on each of up to 2 other target creatures you control. This kind of creature always performs pretty well. You're adding 4 or 5 worth of stats to the board for 4 mana, and 2/3 of it has lifelink, and that's a great deal, for a common especially. And sure, it can't put the counters on itself ever, and you need at least 2 other creatures to really reap the full benefit of this card, and those are limitations to be sure, but not huge ones. I think you'll be pretty happy with 2 of these in most aggro decks. It'll be especially nice in decks that can go wide effectively, and on turn 4, easily have 2 creatures to put counters on. I'm giving it a C+. Next up, we have Basri's Lieutenant, who for 3 generic and a white is a 3/4 human knight at rare. He's got vigilance and protection from multicolored. When it enters the battlefield, you put a +1/+1 counter on target creature you control, and when Basri's Lieutenant or another creature you control dies, if it had a +1/+1 counter on it, you create a 2/2 white knight creature token with vigilance. This guy gives you a lot for the investment. A 4 mana 3/4 Vigilance is usually an okay card, and you have a lot more going on here. You get to add a counter to a creature when he comes down, which includes the Lieutenant in this case, so at worst you're looking at a 4 mana 4/5 with Vigilance, and it will be one that, when it dies, creates a 2/2 Knight with Vigilance. Protection for multicolored isn't a huge factor here, but it does matter a little bit. I don't think he quite crosses over to bomb range, although he might feel more like one if you really get there on +1/+1 counters. Most of the time, though, he's just hugely efficient and won't completely warp the game in his favor, but I think he gets close. I'm giving him a B+. Next up, it's Basri's Solidarity, which for 1 generic and a white is an uncommon sorcery, and it says put a +1/+1 counter on each creature you control. This kind of card can be really hit or miss. If you don't have a good board state, it isn't good. If you have a decent board state, it's alright, and if you've gone really wide, it is hugely powerful. Obviously, white, and especially red-white, is good at going wide in this set. Meanwhile, the green-white deck is a +1/+1 counter deck, so this fits well in both of them. But I like a card to at least have a reasonable fail case, and that is definitely not what we have here. The fail case here is awful. Still, I think this is a solid playable, and again, it's nice it fits into 2 different archetypes really well. I'm giving it a C. Next up, we have Celestial Enforcer, who for 2 generic and a white is a 2/3 human cleric at common. You can pay 1 generic and a white to tap it and tap target creature, but you can only activate that ability if you control a creature with flying. So, A 3-mana 2/3 is a D, and if you don't have enough flyers in your deck, that's what this will be. However, as long as you have 4 or 5 flyers, this does probably get into being a card that you're okay with playing, and in a deck where she can almost always do the Master Decoy thing, she will be better, but even in a deck with a bunch of flyers, she's not going to be able to do it all the time. Overall, I think that means you should probably just value her as a C. Next up, we have Concordia Pegasus, which for 1 generic and a white is a 1/3 common Pegasus at flying. It's an underwhelming reprint and an underwhelming card. A 2-mana 1/3 flyer is usually a C-. It can attack early but doesn't do anything super meaningful most of the time. This format does have, as I've said, +1/+1 counters and a flying archetype, but I think I'll stick with the C- here. You'll play this for sure, but you'll also cut it a decent chunk of the time. Next up, it's Containment Priest, which for 1 generic and a white is a 2/2 human cleric at rare. It's got flash, and if a non-token creature would enter the battlefield and it wasn't cast, exile it instead. This is one of many exciting reprints in this set, but it's a card that was mostly printed to help constructed formats. In Limited, it won't be very often that non-token creatures are entering the battlefield without being cast, but the good news is that a 2-mana 2/2 with flash is probably a C anyway. It can flash in and take down X2s that cost more mana, or kill 1/1s, and it has what are perfectly solid stats. It isn't special in Limited, but it's a fine 2-drop. That rare moment when you do manage to get someone at the enter the battlefield ability will feel incredible, but it won't happen much. There are cards like the blue-black Signpost Uncommon that can reanimate in this format though, so it will happen sometimes. Still, I'm sticking with that C. Next up, we have Daybreak Charger, which for 1 generic and a white is a 3/1 common unicorn, and when it enters the battlefield, target creature gets +2/+0 until end of turn. This is an aggressive little 2-drop, and that's something I like to see, because I feel like we haven't had like a legit aggro deck in a limited format since Eldraine, and that's a while ago. A 2-mana 3/1 is usually a decentish card in Limited, a D+ or C- depending on the speed of the format, and the enter the battlefield ability here is very real. Giving something +2/+0 is often enough to enable attacks that you didn't have before, and giving the boost to a creature token or an evasive creature feels particularly satisfying. I think this will be a premier 2-drop for aggro white decks in this format, which look to be a very real thing. It will work in any white deck just fine though. I'm giving it a C+. Next up, it's Defiant Strike, which for 1 white mana is a common instant that gives a creature +1/+0 until end of turn, and you draw a card. We've seen this a few times, and I've never been that interested in it. It was at its best back in Tarkir, where prowess was everywhere, including on white creatures, but in this set that won't be the case. It's only on blue and red creatures. The stats boost here won't help very many creatures win combat and stay alive, though adding draw a card to it means that the 2-for-1 is technically avoided, though giving up your creature is usually going to be a significant cost. This does have a worst case of just cycling for 1, and that's not terrible, but overall, I don't think I'll be playing this unless I'm desperate. I'm giving it a D. Next up, it's Dub, which for 2 generic and a white is a common enchantment aura with enchant creature, and the enchanted creature gets +2/+2, has first strike, and is a knight in addition to its other types. As always, I'm pretty skeptical about auras. They have to either offer a huge bonus or help you avoid the dreaded 2-for-1, which usually puts you behind on cards and in tempo, and that's hard to recover from. We've seen Dub before though, and it did perform better than I expected. The boost here is enough to make many creatures into threatening ones. So, while it doesn't do anything to keep you from getting blown out if your opponent has removal, it does put your opponent in a situation where, if they can't deal with whatever you dub, they're going to be in some serious trouble. It is still an aura, something incredibly risky, but it does enough that it will make the cut more often than it won't, especially in aggressive white decks. I'm giving it a C-. Next up, it's Faith's Fetters, which for 3 generic and a white is an enchantment aura at uncommon. It has enchant permanent. When it enters the battlefield, you gain 4 life. An enchanted permanent can't attack or block, and its activated abilities can't be activated unless they're mana abilities. This is a great removal spell every time we see it. It costs twice as much as Pacifism, maybe, but I think it more than makes up for it. For one thing, it shuts down activated abilities. For another, it can be used on any permanent that might have a problematic activated ability, including planeswalkers. Most of the time, you want to put this on a creature, obviously enough, but that flexibility is nice. Finally, it also gains you 4 life, which makes it a little less painful to tap out to play this or something like that. And there is a life gain deck in the format. Overall, Fetters is great because it does a better job of entirely shutting down a creature than most white removal spells. Overall, this is premium removal and something you take pretty highly. I'm giving it a B. Next up, it's Falconer Adept, which for 3 generic and a white is a 2/3 human soldier at uncommon, and when it attacks, you create a 1/1 white bird creature token with flying that's tapped and attacking. This is kind of disappointing to me. The text box here is great, I love skies decks and I love birds, but the stats here, not so much. A 4-mana 2/3 will be lucky to even trade with something on a lot of board states, so sending your Adept in just to make a 1/1 flyer often won't be worth it, assuming it can't trade with something. Now, this format does have +1/+1 counters, especially in green and white, and if you can make this big enough that it's more of a problem in combat, things could get interesting. I think you're happy if you can just make your opponent trade with it and you get a bird out of the deal. If you get to attack with it more than once, it will be pretty nice. That said, I think this has some very real limitations. It realistically won't be a threat on many board states, even on turn 4. I think it's just a C. Next up, it's Feet of Resistance, which for 1 generic and a white is a common instant, and it says put a +1/+1 counter on target creature you control. It gains protection from the color of your choice until end of turn. This is a welcome reprint. Last time we saw it in Tarkir, it was an excellent trick. That's because it's so darn flexible and efficient. Protection is just very powerful. The obvious way to use this is to win combat one way or another by making your creature big enough and also giving it protection from whatever it is in combat with. But you can also use it in response to removal, to save a creature, or if your opponent has only blockers of one color and you need evasion for lethal, it can do that too. Not to mention, it puts a +1/+1 counter on the creature, and as I've said many times already, there is synergy for that in this set. Now, your opponent can still respond to Feet with removal, to 2 for 1 you, but the flexibility and upside is real enough that I don't see a reason to cut the first couple of copies of this in most white decks. I'm also pretty sure it was uncommon last time. It being at common might be a little bit of a headache, so be ready for it, know that it might blow you out, keep this card in mind. I'm giving it a C+. Next up, it's Gale Swooper, who for 3 generic and a white is a 3/2 griffin at common. It's got flying, and when it enters the battlefield, target creature gains flying until end of turn. A 4-mana 3/2 flyer is usually a C or a C-. Those are reasonable stats for an evasive creature. Giving something else flying is a very real enter the battlefield ability, and one that will frequently make attacks happen that just couldn't happen before. And remember, the blue-white flying deck is an archetype, so that gives it a bit of extra power. I think you always run your first copy of this. I'm giving it a C+. Next up, we have Glorious Anthem, which for 1 generic and 2 white is a rare enchantment, and creatures you control get +1/+1. The original Anthem is back. This type of card can be frustrating sometimes because you get it on a board where you just don't have much of a presence, but the effect offered by the Anthem is powerful and does impact the board immediately in many cases, enabling attacks that weren't possible before you played it. You do need to be a heavy creature deck and going pretty wide to take advantage of it, but that doesn't seem to be a problem in white decks in the format. I think the Anthem is in the lower range of first pickable. I'm giving it a B-. Next up, it's Griffin Airy, which for 1 generic and a white is an uncommon enchantment, and at the beginning of your end step, if you gain 3 or more life this turn, create a 2/2 white griffin creature token with flying. This is a very nice life gain payoff, and life gain seems well supported enough for this to be legit. Turning life gain into actual cards feels great, and a 2/2 flyer is definitely a real card, especially if you can get more than one of them out of this. Even the first one is given to you at a pretty good rate, so if this really starts churning them out, things could get interesting. Obviously, you have to have a deck that can not only gain life, but gain 3 or more life a turn at least a few times a game for this to be worth it, and as a result of that, I do think we have a build around here. I think your average white deck will probably have enough life gain to make this kind of okay, but it won't be very good. Probably a D. But in a deck that can really get things going with it, it's going to be one of the best payoffs in your deck since it provides you with a very real win condition. I think this is going to be a B in a deck that gets there on life gain, which probably means black-white, but it also looks like green-white can do some work in that department. The not unplayable floor and the very high ceiling means that going after this early is probably worthwhile. Next up, we have Idol of Endurance, which for 2 generic and a white is a rare artifact, and when it enters the battlefield, you exile all creature cards with converted mana cost 3 or less from your graveyard until Idol of Endurance leaves the battlefield. You can also pay 1 generic and a white to tap it, and until end of turn, you may cast a creature spell from among the cards exiled with Idol of Endurance without paying its mana cost. This card has a cool design, and obviously enough, it's a build-around. Most decks in Limited won't have enough cards with a converted mana cost of 3 or less to make this worthwhile. Another aspect you have to have is some way of loading up your graveyard. Now, You can accomplish this by trading aggressively in the early game for sure, and that will really pan out sometimes, but the setup cost here is very real. Real enough that this will be a dead card most of the time in the early part of games, and even in the mid game most of the time. In the late game, it's definitely a value engine, provided you were able to exile like 3 things. Making sure that you can cast a creature every turn at that stage of the game is a serious advantage, but still, I think for your deck to really succeed with this, you have to be doing some strange stuff. First, you need a low curve, and second, you need to be able to get to the late game. Those 2 things don't always go hand in hand, and I can definitely see this having a high ceiling, and it will be fun to play with since I love late game value engines, but I don't think your average white deck will be able to make this work in this format. I would guess it's probably a D+ in most white decks, but in a deck that gets there on the odd combination of having a low curve and being kind of controlling, it will be pretty good, probably at least a B. The question here is how hard it will be to get to that B, and I think for now, I would steer clear of taking this too early. Next up, it's Legion's Judgment, which for 2 generic and a white is a common sorcery, destroy target creature with power 4 or greater. This is another reprint, and we usually see an effect like this in every set anyway. This being sorcery speed is kind of sad because sometimes when it's an instant, you can use it after combat tricks that make a creature big enough to be targeted by it, and when you do that, you're really blowing your opponent out. It can still kill big stuff, and most people have enough targets that it is a reasonable main deck card, but it's nowhere near premium removal with its major limitations. It's just a C. Next up, it's Light of Promise, which for 2 generic and a white is an uncommon enchantment aura with enchant creature, and it says enchanted creature has, whenever you gain life, put that many +1/+1 counters on this creature. I don't like this very much. When I talked about dub, I said I needed to get a really big effective bonus that makes a creature great right away, or I need a card to do something to negate the downside of getting 2 for 1, like draw me a card or something like that. This is an aura that does absolutely nothing on its own. You have to have life gain around, and even though the black-white deck in this format is about gaining life, I'm still not interested in an aura that makes me do extra work to get a bonus, especially when it costs 3 mana. Putting it on something with lifelink is tempting, but I'm going to resist that temptation. I realize that the creature gets absolutely huge as you gain more life, since it gets a counter for every single point of life you gain, but the investment here is huge, risky, and requires some serious help to be worth it. I'm not interested in all of that when I'm putting a 2 for 1 on the line. I'm giving this an F. Next up, it's Makeshift Battalion, which for 2 generic and a white is a 3/2 human soldier at common, and when it attacks with at least 2 other creatures, you put a +1/+1 counter on Makeshift Battalion. This is another reprint from the recent past. This does a good job of supporting both the Go Wide deck and the +1/+1 counter deck, but it's not stellar. A 3-mana 3/2 won't be surviving more attacks. A 3-mana 3/2 won't be surviving most attacks, and while a 4/3 has a better shot, it isn't exactly a juggernaut either. This is just an alright card, although, like I said, I do like how it supports 2 decks, but I think it's just a C. Next up, we have Mangara, the Diplomat, which for 3 generic and a white is a 2/4 legendary human cleric at Mythic Rare. It has lifelink, and whenever an opponent attacks with creatures, if 2 or more of those creatures are attacking you and or planeswalkers you control, draw a card, and whenever an opponent casts their second spell each turn, draw a card. So, a 4-mana 2/4 with lifelink is at least a C, and this obviously comes with a ton of extra value since it punishes your opponent for playing more than 1 spell a turn, or even for attacking you with 1 or more creature. It doesn't straight up stop them from doing stuff, but drawing cards anytime those things happens is some serious business that will completely change the state of the board in many situations. Now, sometimes it will be a little too late, but most of the time, Mangara will be capable of shifting things in your favor. Overall, I think Mangara is something you feel good about first picking most of the time, but I don't think it's a straight up bomb. I'm giving Mangara a B. Next up, we have 9 Lives, which for 1 generic and 2 white is a rare enchantment with hexproof. It says if a source would deal damage to you, prevent that damage and put an incarnation counter on 9 lives, and when there are 9 or more incarnation counters on 9 lives, exile it, and when it leaves the battlefield, you lose the game. This is a weird one to evaluate, admittedly. So, for 3 mana, you get to prevent 8 separate instances of damage. I say 8 because when the 9th instance of damage happens, 9 lives goes away and you lose the game. So the question is, how much time are you buying yourself by preventing 8 instances of damage? It's a hard question to answer, and one that is highly dependent on what your opponent is doing. If they're an aggro deck, every single one of their creatures that hits you puts a counter on this. If they're a more control-y deck, this is probably more effective because those decks have fewer creatures and thus fewer sources of damage. It's made stranger by the fact that, in a lot of ways, playing it early is not what you want to do. Generally, if this is in your hand, you're going to need to take a lot of hits, get down low on life, and that's what you want to do before you play it to take full advantage of what the card can do for you. But this is weakened by the fact that there are a few cards in this set that cause a loss of life, even at low rarities, and if it's not causing damage, 9 lives doesn't prevent it. This means if you do go really low, there are still cards that can kill you, and that's going to be a real bummer. I think overall, this just won't do enough for you most of the time. It'll buy you some time, but cards that do that are rarely worth it in Limited. It isn't like you were going to combo off or something most of the time. I want to start this at an F, with the caveat that this card is weird enough that it wouldn't be the most shocking thing ever if it turned out to be at least decent, but I think I'm probably right that this is an F. Next up we have Pact Leader, which for 1 generic and a white is a 2/2 dog at rare. Other dogs you control get +1/+1, and whenever it attacks, prevent all combat damage that would be dealt this turn to dogs you control. So again, hounds are now dogs, and all the things that would have been hounds in this set are dogs, and all the hounds from the games past are also dogs now. This is apparently something Mark Rosewater has been fighting for a long time, and he finally won the fight. Pact Leader is a really good lord, and is good even on its own. It's a 2-mana 2/2 that can't be killed by combat damage when it's attacking, which means that it gives you an attack every turn that is virtually free. And your opponent has to respect the fact that you might have tricks or other nonsense, so in many board states, they're just going to have to let it through. Then you throw in the ability to pump other dogs, not to mention the fact that it makes all of them have that damage prevention ability, and you have an impressive little guy right here. I think his reasonable floor is a really good 2-drop, and the upside of making all your dogs scary is enough to make this worth first picking in some weaker packs. I'm giving it a B-. Next up, we have Rambunctious Mutt, which for 3 generic and 2 white is a 3/4 dog at common, and when it enters the battlefield, you destroy target artifact or enchantment an opponent controls. I don't think you want to have this in your main deck. He's just not very efficient if he isn't taking down an artifact or enchantment, and I don't get the feeling that this format has so many of those that you can do it with any kind of regularity. I think it's a D if you have to play it in your main deck, and a C out of your sideboard. Next up we have Revitalize, which for 1 generic and a white is a common instant. It says you gain 3 life, draw a card. We've seen this before, and it was pretty underwhelming. Even in a set that has a life gain theme, this isn't going to be something that makes the cut most of the time. It's an alright cantrip, so you can certainly do worse, but I think in an ideal world, you're not playing this. I'm giving it a D+. Next up, it's Ruined Halo, which for 2 white mana is a rare enchantment, and when it enters the battlefield, you choose a card name, and you have protection from the chosen card name. This reprint is kind of like removal. It makes it so that you can sort of disregard your opponent's best creature in play, except that the creature can still block your creatures and use all of its abilities. It is a pretty sweet answer that can deal with your opponent's bomb, but it doesn't really answer that creature. It just makes it worse. So we can't just say this is removal straight up, and it certainly isn't premium. And yes, you can gain protection from spells and various other things too, but you'll rarely do that in Limited. All in all, I don't think you want to first pick this or even really get close to it. It's like a removal spell that makes your opponent's best creature unable to attack, which is fine, but certainly not a good removal spell. I think it's just a C. Next up, it's Sanctum of Tranquil Light, which for 1 white mana is an uncommon legendary enchantment shrine, and for 5 generic and a white, you can tap a creature, and this ability costs 1 less to cast for each shrine you control. So, way back in Kamigawa, we had a similar cycle, and if you could manage to get a few of these shrines, they were pretty darn good together. So, I think there's a real chance that there is a shrine deck in this format, assuming you can manage to get a few of them, and by a few, I mean like 4 or 5. Most of them are not very good on their own, so I don't really recommend going after them early, but if you see them starting to wheel, think long and hard about going after them. This shrine in particular is 1 mana, and it doesn't really do anything on its own until you get to 5 mana, at which point you can use it to tap down creatures. That's an alright mana sink ability, and one that can be really useful in the late game, but it will really just feel like you mulligan in the early game, and that's not where you want to be. If you have extra shrines and can lower that cost, that's when things get truly interesting, and obviously the other shrines all like other shrines too, so it gets much better value in a deck interested in doing that. Overall, I don't really think you should play this most of the time if it's your only shrine, unless you really have to. It's probably a D, but in the shrine deck, it's probably a C+. And for all of these shrines throughout the week, I'll be giving them a this is what it would be in a deck that doesn't have enough shrines, and this is what it would be in a shrine deck. Next up, we have Seasoned Hallow Blade, which for 1 generic into white is a 3/1 human warrior at uncommon, and you can discard a card and tap it to give it indestructible until end of turn. As I've already said, a 2-mana 3/1 is usually a D+ or a C-, depending on how viable an aggro deck is in a given format, and I think in this format, they're pretty viable. While he isn't quite as good as a Daybreak Vanguard in most ways, I do think the comparison is warranted. Both are great attackers all game long, thanks to their ability to become indestructible, and both can even be effective blockers all game long. And actually, the Hallow Blade's a better blocker because it's a 3/1 on your opponent's turn 2. It doesn't have to be attacking to be a 3/1. Discarding a card is a hefty cost for sure, but generally you'll be doing it to trade with something of your opponent's, whether a creature in combat or a removal spell, so going down the card isn't as brutal as it sounds. The fact he has to tap down to become indestructible does mean that your opponent's removal spells will at least make him tap, and sometimes that will be a bad thing. But still, a 2-drop that attacks all game long is great. Even just the threat of activation means your opponent will be taking 3 to the face a lot when you attack with this. I think this will feel similar to a Daybreak Vanguard, which again is to say I think you should first pick this sometimes, giving him a B-. Next up we have Secure the Scene, which for 4 generic into white is a common sorcery. It says exile target non-land permanent. Its controller creates a 1/1 white soldier creature token. The flexibility here is nice. However, the mana cost and giving your opponent a 1/1 soldier, not so nice. It's especially clunky as a sorcery. That said, I think most white decks will be interested in playing one copy of this because it is a catch-all. Dealing with all 9-land permanents is not something you see every day, and while giving them a 1/1 is a bit obnoxious, it will always be downgrading their creature, and it isn't like the 1/1 you give them is worth a whole lot. But yeah, this is certainly not a premium removal spell, and playing more than one of these is not ideal, but the fact that it can hit enchantments, artifacts, creatures, planeswalkers even, makes it better than it might be if it could only exile a creature. I'm giving it a C+. Next up we have Selfless Savior, which for 1 white mana is a 1/1 uncommon dog, and he can sacrifice himself to give target creature indestructible until end of turn. 1 mana 1/1s are often not very good in limited because their board presence is so negligible, and they quickly become irrelevant. This dog comes with an extra ability that is pretty nice though. He can do a bad Mother of Runes impression, in that your opponent always has to contend with the fact that while the dog's in play, it can be used to really mess up lots of things, like combat and removal spells. Basically, this is such a good dog that he's willing to give himself up to save one of your better creatures. Seems like a solid card to me, giving him a C. Next up we have Siege Striker, which for 2 generic into white is a 1/1 human soldier at uncommon. It's got double strike, and when it attacks, you can tap any number of untapped creatures you control, and it gets +1/+1 until end of turn for each creature tapped this way. Generally, a 3 mana 1/1 with double strike is not a great rate. 2/2 is usually what you're looking for that investment. And sure, this guy can get bigger than that, but only from its ability and only when it attacks, so it doesn't block quite as well as most double strikers. But still, this seems like an alright payoff for going wide and really generates a creature who can represent a ton of damage on his own. Now, tapping down your creatures when you attack is no joke. It isn't something you'll always have the time to do, and oftentimes, just attacking with everything is better. However, sometimes you just need to send in one attacker, and this guy can do that for you. It will feel a bit like Exalted in that sense, I think. But still, he won't always be able to impact the board in a meaningful way, and he starts so small and vulnerable, I think it's just a C-. Next up we have Speaker of the Heavens, which for 1 white mana is a 1/1 human cleric at rare with vigilance and lifelink, and you can tap it to create a 4/4 white angel creature token with flying, but you can only activate that ability if you have at least 7 life more than your starting life total, and only anytime you could cast a sorcery. So, let's look at this guy on the French vanilla test. How good is a 1 mana 1/1 with vigilance and lifelink in a set that has a reasonable number of +1/+1 counters? It's probably kind of okay. Something that will make the cut about half the time, so probably a C-, I guess, and that may even be generous. But if your deck is super good at gaining life, this gets to be ridiculous, since churning out 4/4 angels is no joke. Even if you only get 1 angel out of this, you're getting more than your mana's worth. That said, doing that is going to be a challenge, even in the life gain deck in this format. You have to really get there on life gain to have 7 life more than your starting life total in limited. But the good news is, he's kind of okay on his own, and you'll probably run him in most of your life gain decks just because sometimes, maybe he'll actually make an angel. Overall, though, I think he's just a C-. Next up we have Staunch Shieldmate, which for 1 white mana is a 1/3 dwarf soldier at common. Those are some impressive stats on a 1 mana vanilla creature. We've never seen a 1 mana 1/3 with no downsides at all. That said, while he might do well on the vanilla test, he still isn't that impressive in limited. A 2 mana 1/3 is usually a D-, and he's clearly better than that because he costs 1 mana. Additionally, white aggressive decks like the +1/+1 counter deck and the Go Wide deck will find him to be a solid 1-drop who powers up their other cards. Still, he is quickly outclassed without some help, and while I think you'll end up playing him more often than you won't, he's probably just another C-. Next up we have Swift Response, which for 1 generic and a white is a common instant, and it says destroy target tapped creature. 2 mana to kill a creature at instant speed is a pretty good deal, even if it can only target tapped creatures. That does mean this is not an ideal removal for aggro decks, though, who want to get blockers out of the way. But in a more mid-rangey or control deck, this will be a nice removal spell, one that will usually give you a tempo advantage, and one that can sometimes get blowouts out of the fact that your opponent uses a combat trick while attacking. Now, it is still situational, and as I said, all decks don't want it, so I do think it falls short of being considered a premium removal spell, but I think it's a C+. Next up we have Tempered Veteran, who for 1 generic and a white is a 1/2 human knight at uncommon. You can pay 1 white mana and tap it to put a +1/+1 counter on target creature with a +1/+1 counter on it, and you can pay 4 generic and 2 white to put a +1/+1 counter on target creature. So this starts with some mediocre stats, but has some nice activated abilities. 1 mana to add a counter is a great deal, but it's so efficient because you won't always be able to do it. As we've said already, there are +1/+1 counters in this set, and in general, the deck where it's going to be at its best is in green-white. So the veteran will be able to use that ability somewhat often in those decks, but I would caution against just expecting it to always work out. Paying 6 for a single counter is less impressive, but in the late game, adding a counter every turn, even if you're flooding out, isn't too bad, especially because after the first counter, you can start paying a single white mana to add additional counters. I think this is a bit of a build-around, but one that has a reasonable floor. It's probably a C in a regular white deck. You'll have enough +1/+1 counters around, and it has reasonable enough things going on, even in the absence of them, that it's certainly solid. But if you get there on a +1/+1 counter deck and can pay 1 mana with regularity to put counters on things, it moves up to a B. And I think that means that you can take this early and maybe even first pick it in some weaker packs. Next up we have Valorous Steed, who for 4 generic and a white is a 3/3 unicorn common. It's got Vigilance, and when it enters the battlefield, you create a 2/2 White Knight creature token with Vigilance. This is a nice common. 5 mana for 5/5 worth of Vigilance stats across 2 bodies is a nice deal, especially in a format with some nice go-wide payoffs. You probably don't want more than 2 of these since they cost 5, but it will do some nice work for you in any deck, especially for a common, giving it a C+. Next up we have Rinwing, who for 2 generic and a white is a 2/1 uncommon Pegasus with flying, and non-creature spells cost 1 more to cast. Interesting to see this card downshifted to uncommon. It was rare last time we saw it. Anyway, a 3 mana 2/1 flyer is usually like a C-, but this also comes with a symmetrical tax effect. As a result of that, you don't really want to be playing this in a deck that has lots of non-creature spells, but if you're in an aggro deck and most of your deck is creatures, you're going to be in business with this, since it will hate on your opponent more than you, in addition to having reasonable stats. I think that makes this a C. And our last white card is Warded Battlements, which for 2 generic and a white is a 0/3 wall at common with Defender, and attacking creatures you control get +1/+0. Well, our final white card is kind of a weird one. Weird because it's a payoff for go-wide aggro decks where the boost will be the most effective, but also weird because it has Defender, and that's not usually what you're looking for in an aggro deck. Now that I think about it, the Battlements are probably actually at their best in the Blue-White Skies deck. Those decks usually need blockers on the ground while they attack in the air, and +1/+0 on a bunch of flyers is pretty nice. Still, I don't think this is something you're always running in either of the decks that it's probably best in, and that's not a great sign. I'm giving it a C-. Well, that does it for all the white cards in Core Set 2021. If you disagree with any of my evaluations, let me know in the comments. Discussion about these cards can only help us all be better at Magic. Tomorrow, I'll be back to look at all the blue cards in this set. By the way, my videos are sponsored by Card Kingdom, and you can pre-order Core Set 2021 there now if you follow my referral link in the description, so check that out. Anyway, if you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like it and share it so that others can enjoy it too. If you want to make sure you see the rest of the set review and a bunch more limited content, don't forget to subscribe. And if you're watching this video after more videos in this series have come out, you will also see the playlist right about now, so check it out. Thanks for watching.